Hey everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot to-do application project. Wazoo here, and this is another exciting video using Java Spring Boot and doing some cool stuff today. I'm looking forward to it. Let's get started. So here we are in our application where we left things off in our first session. This is as a quick refresher, we're making a to-do application with some little cool add-ons that we'll just be continuously adding to as we develop this thing. So we started off our project template with the help of start.spring.io. We've created a TodoItem model. We've added an associative page controller and repository for the model. And we are displaying welcome to the HTML file in our website. Ta-da! There we go, on port 3000. Let's kick things off in this session, starting off with the H2 console. So H2 is a development-based database that is really popular for Spring Boot development. So consider it the equivalent to something like SQLite for Ruby on Rails. It's a light either memory database or a file one that we can work with on our local server. So for now we're storing it, if you recall, in our properties file. Let's get back to it to show you what I mean. In our application.properties file, we've got, okay, let's shrink this down. We've got a data source URL of a file, and it's being stored in the /data/todo app folder of our application. So as we move on forward past development, maybe we want to deploy this to something like Heroku or another cloud provider, then this is where we would change this URL to something a little more cloud friendly that would then store our table onto said cloud. Okay, but we've now got this up and running, and we have, if you remember in our properties, we've got the H2 console enabled. So if you haven't worked with the H2 console before, let's go ahead and quickly open that up, and I'll show you how cool it is in terms of being able to use it to verify our queries, verify the data that we're storing in our database. So back in our browser, if we first blow this up a little more, okay, and then on our URL, let's type in /h2 console, and we should be getting a login screen. Oh, of course it can't reach the page because we haven't actually started the server yet. So let's go ahead and start that server. It should be started up by now. Okay, Java server is running, no real errors right now. So let's go ahead and refresh. Okay, and now we've got our login form. Let's widen that out a little bit. And so we can keep a lot of this the same. We don't need to touch this. Here for the JDBC URL, we've got JDBC H2, JDBC:/H2:, and then ./data/ we called it Todo App. So basically it has to match what you have set up in the properties file, Todo App. Okay, let's go back here. And now for username and password, we just used admin. So let's go ahead and type that in, hit connect, and we should now see the actual tables within the database. So if we highlight our to-do item, this is right from our model. This is what's generated right from our model. And let's hit run. We should have no to-do items in the database right now. But we can see on the bottom, let's pull this up, that we've got our structure in place. So we've got our ID, we've got our completed flag, our date created, date modified, and our description. That's pretty cool. So we'll see that fill in as we populate our data. Okay, so in the other tab, I'm just going to go back to our application. So I'll keep one tab open for the console and the other tab for our application. So that is a really brief introduction to using the H2 console. Okay, so we've got our, oh, I keep using this one when I want to use the source one. Okay, so we've got our page controller, which just returns our welcome screen, and we've got a to-do item model. And so now let's go ahead and let's create a to-do list item. And so this is, actually we'll just call it to-do list. It won't be to-do list item. So to-do list will be there'll be a nested model. It'll have a connection with the to-do item table in terms of we can have multiple to-do items belonging to one to-do list. And each to-do list will have its own corresponding rows of to-do items. Maybe that's a better way to explain it. So back in our models folder, let's go ahead and create a to-do list. To-do list.java. Okay, and it's a list, and since we need to create a database table from it, let's also extend serializable. Maybe we just need to implement it. Implements serializable. Okay, done. And it is also an entity. Now a lot of the methods we can reuse in some way that we did from the JavaX persistence entity. Okay, within our to-do list. Okay, so that way each to-do list will have its own ID. This is our generation strategy, and we'll have an associative getter and setter. So let's hit control dot, which will pull in the appropriate references. So that all looks fine and good. Back to the concept, what I was mentioning before about nested models. At least this is the term for it in Java Spring Boot. In other server technologies, it might be something worded slightly differently depending on the framework you're using, but for the most part, it's a concept of nested models in that we have our parent model here, which is our to-do list, and we want to have a bunch of associative to-do items that are part of this to-do list. So to do that, we are going to be creating what's called a one-to-many connection. So in other words, for every one to-do list model, we can have many associative to-do items. So we want to create a one-to-many, and we need a mapped by name. And so this is how we're going to be this relationship with the to-do item. So let's call it to-do item. Whoops, to-do item. So fetch equals fetch type eager. Cascade equals cascade type all. Okay, and we'll have a Lombok getter and setter for it. Okay, and so we want a private list of to-do item, and we'll just call them to-do items. So we've got this set up, and now over on the to-do item side, we've got to make one update to make it known that we're working with a parent relationship in a one-to-many relationship. Sorry. Okay, so we will call this ManyToOne, and then fetch equals fetch type lazy, optional equals false. So we're going to join column. Okay, to do list ID. Let's see if this works. Okay, and I'll explain what some of these annotations mean once we get this finished. Okay, and then a private to-do list, and we'll call this to-do list mapped by to-do. Okay, I wonder if we have these. We might have these backwards, or not backwards, but we might have these misnamed. But let's go ahead and create one. So we're creating a many-to-one relationship between our, we've got a reference to our to-do list for each of our to-do items. We are using a fetch type of lazy, which basically just means we're only going to be pulling in the referenced data as we need it. So whenever we need to work with it, that's when the database will fetch all of the rows that match what we're trying to do. So we're joining our column, so we need to join our create a join between our ID of the to-do list with the ID and map it to the ID of what's in the to-do item. That way we've got that relationship mapping between the two. We want to be able to set this one, so that we need the setter annotation, and JSON ignore. That annotation just means that when we reference this item back in our HTML, like we're creating a cyclical dependency cycle if we keep printing out parents and children, because as your parent of your child might have other children, which might then re-reference the same parent, which will then reference the same children, etc., etc. It kind of gets confusing. So to ignore all that and to hide it from happening, we can just we can just make use of the JSON ignore annotation, which means it won't return when we're trying to display this out to or work with it as an object in JavaScript. So let's see if this will work. Since this is capitalized L here, we might need to capitalize L there. Okay, so let's see if this creates a proper, or if this starts everything up properly. No. Okay, that looks a little better. So what we needed to do is when I created this mapped by parameter to this one-to-many annotation in the to-do list class, I mistakenly referenced this as a to-do item. And so what we need to do is make this reference as a to-do list, because we are referencing this to-do list back in the child model. As you work more with nested models, it becomes a whole lot more easier to do this mapping within your head. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh just to make sure that everything works okay and we don't encounter any problems. Okay, so let's now test out some of this by going back into our welcome controller. So currently right now what we have right now is our public string, and which is returning the file name of our HTML template. So another thing that we can return is some actual model data. And this will be a good way to sort of just make sure that we've got proper things configured in our nested model relationship. Okay, so first of all, what we need to do is make use of the auto-wired annotation to pull in a to-do item repository, to-do item repository. And we'll need to do the same thing with our to-do list repository that we will create very shortly here. Next, this is to-do list repository. So the to-do list repository, isn't yet existing because we didn't create it. So let's go ahead and create it now. So back in our repositories folder, let's just create a new one, a new file, and we'll call it to-do list repository. Okay, and we're working with a interface, and we are extending JPA repository, and then we are working with to-do lists and long for the IDs. A JPA interface, a repository for our to-do list. So back in our page controller, we can make use of both of these repositories. Going forward, I'll show you how we can refactor these into a service that we work with, which touches these repositories rather than working with these repositories directly in our controllers, it's not quote unquote bad, but it's kind of messy, and in some places it's frowned upon. So at any rate, okay. So we can also return a model in view. So this is a special object of Spring Boot framework, and what we can do is create a let's see, model and view equals new model and view, and then for our view we can set it to oh, of course it would help if I declared this variable properly. Okay, so model and view, and we want to set view name to welcome. Now we can do that in the constructor of this. We can pass that in the constructor, but I think it just makes it a little bit easier to follow what's going along if you've never used model and view before. And we want to return model and view. Okay, so now what we also want to do is return some data. So let's do a model and view add object. Okay, add object, and then so we're going to pass in a name. So let's say data, and then let's just say a new to-do item. First we'll create a to-do list. So to-do list equals new to-do list. Okay, and then to-do item equals new. Okay, here's what we'll do. This will be the easiest way to test this out. Okay, so we're going to be creating a to-do list and a to-do item. So new to-do item. Okay, this will be great. Okay, and let's import these models. And you're wondering what we're going to be using the repositories for. Just 1 second, and we'll do that. Okay, so now because a to-do list needs, or a to-do item needs a to-do list, we're going to be having a to-do item set to-do list. Okay, and then let's create just a fake first to-do item. So set completed of false, and set, let's see, description. Set description overuse of hello world, but whatever. Hello world, have we completed it? No. Okay, so now what we need to do, just for this data to be saved in our database, we need to make use of the repository to save these objects. So first, in our to-do list repository, we'll save the to-do list. Okay, and then our to-do item repository, we will also call save on the to-do item. And then we will return the model and view object, which will just give us the usual welcome screen. So let's go ahead. My plan is that we'll restart the server. We'll hit refresh on our browser to see the welcome text, and then we'll go into the H2 console and verify that these objects are now created within the database. Okay, this will be cool. Okay, so let's hit refresh. Done. So the welcome text comes up on our localhost 3000. So we're going to have to refresh from the H2 console to log in again. It's going to make us log in again, no problem. So remember admin. Let's connect. And now we see that we've got two tables here, to-do lists and a to-do item. So click on to-do list and let's hit run, which will select star from it. And we have a single row with an ID of 1. Okay, promising. So far so good. So let's clear this and then go into our to-do item, hit run, and let's go back into our database. So we've got an ID of 2. Completed is now false, which is what we set. We've got a date created stamp and a date modified stamp, which should be roughly the same. We've got a description of hello world and a to-do list ID, which is the parent of 1, which matches the ID in our to-do list. So pretty cool. We've got our nested relationship set up correctly between the two objects. We've got data showing up in our database tables. We've got still the same HTML coming from the front end, but whatever. Now that we have our data set up properly, we can now do some fun stuff with what's coming through in the data. So I think that's a really good place for us to stop in this episode. We covered quite a bit of ground, and I can't wait to get going into the next one. Hope you join me. I'm Wazoo. Have a really good rest of the day wherever you are. Peace.